Welcome to a journey through one of the most unsettling cases in American history. Before we dive in, tell me in the comments where you're watching from. This bond we share makes every story more alive, every mystery more tangible. Today, we'll uncover events that took place over a century ago. Events that still linger in the quiet mountains of the eastern United States, like an unanswered whisper carried by the wind. Picture the year 1933. The 20th century had only just begun, brimming with promises of innovation and progress. In the cities, automobiles were starting to outnumber horse-drawn carriages. In factories, the Industrial Revolution continued to reshape how people lived and worked. Yet far from the urban noise, deep in the mountain ranges along the eastern coast, time moved at a slower rhythm. Amid mist, shrouded peaks and deep valleys where sunlight barely reached, nature still held dominion, untouched by the march of modernity. The Appalachian Trail, though not yet officially named as we know it, already existed as a network of ancient routes stretching more than 2,000 miles. These paths connected isolated settlements, crossed dense forests, and climbed peaks that seemed to touch the heavens. Hunters, traders, and wanderers once used them in search of something beyond the confines of civilization. Back then, walking these trails wasn't a pastime, it was an endeavor that demanded courage, foresight, and a good measure of luck. Against this backdrop, 14 people chose to embark on an expedition they believed would be unforgettable. The group was varied, men and women from several states, brought together by a shared passion for exploring a remote and little charted stretch of the Appalachians. Their plan was to depart from southern Virginia and head toward Tennessee, traversing some of the wildest and least explored terrain. The journey was set to last around 3 weeks, covering roughly 400 kilometers of rugged ground. Months of preparation went into the trip. The participants, many of whom only knew each other through correspondence, exchanged letters to organize every detail. Among them was a natural history professor from Boston, fascinated by mountain geology, a young novelist from Richmond, Virginia, seeking inspiration for her next book, 2 brothers from Charleston, South Carolina, eager to test their survival skills, and a retired doctor from Philadelphia who saw the trek as a way to reconnect with nature. Alongside them were 9 others, each carrying personal reasons and private hopes for the journey. Their meeting place was Damascus, a small town in southwest Virginia. It was early September, the time when summer slowly yields to autumn and the mountain air cools to a pleasant calm. The timing was deliberate. The days were still long enough for extended hikes, but the suffocating summer heat had faded. Spring's heavy rains were also behind them, reducing the risk of treacherous mud and overflowing rivers. When the 14 travelers finally gathered, excitement filled the air. They carried sturdy canvas packs loaded with provisions, dried meats, hard biscuits, grains, preserved foods, and cooking utensils. Some had simple cameras, hoping to capture the majesty of the wilderness. Others brought journals, ready to document every moment. Firearms were also part of their people, not because they feared other people, but as protection against the black bears and wild boars that roamed those woods. That morning, before setting off, they stood together for a group photograph outside the town's only hotel. The picture, still preserved today in the Washington County Archives, shows cheerful faces and confident smiles. None of them could have imagined what the coming weeks would bring. No one could have foreseen that this image would become one of the few surviving traces of 10 people who would vanish without a trace. The first few days passed without incident. The hikers made steady progress, pausing often to admire hidden waterfalls, strange rock shapes, and sweeping views of endless valleys. At night, they camped in clearings chosen with care, built campfires, and traded stories beneath skies glittering with more stars than any city could ever reveal. But mountains keep their own secrets, and not every trail leads home. What we know about those early days comes mostly from a journal kept by Sarah Elizabeth Crawford, the young writer from Richmond. Her entries, discovered decades later, offer rare insight into the group's routine and surroundings. She wrote with a poet's eye, describing how sunlight filtered through the trees in shifting patterns, how the thin air at high altitudes revived her lungs, and how the silence of those peaks felt different from any silence she had ever known. On the 4th day, the group reached a summit locals called Black Crow Peak. The name came from an old native legend about a great bird said to have lived on those heights long before settlers arrived. From that vantage point, the view was extraordinary. Rolling hills blanketed in blue, green hues that shifted with the moving light. Far in the distance, faint trails of smoke rose from lone farmhouses, the only signs of human life in the vast expanse. It was here that the natural history professor, Edmund Whitmore, made an observation later noted in Sarah's journal. Pointing west, he spoke about how these mountains once served as natural walls, slowing the advance of early colonists who had to seek out narrow passes or risk perilous crossings. He spoke passionately about the exposed rock layers and the marine fossils found high above sea level, evidence that these mountains had once slept beneath an ancient sea. Until that moment, harmony prevailed among the group. The retired Dr. Thomas Hicks had taken on the role of caretaker, ensuring everyone was hydrated, free of blisters, and rested. The Dalton brothers, Robert and James, proved adept at campcraft, able to spark fires even with damp wood. And William Fletcher, an amateur cartographer, spent his evenings updating rough maps, carefully marking the paths they had conquered so far. During the daylight hours, but as the expedition pressed westward into increasingly isolated territory, small cracks began to form within the group. The trails grew faint, often disappearing beneath carpets of dead leaves and thick vegetation. In some stretches, they had to hack their way through with machetes, an exhausting effort that drained their strength and consumed valuable time. Supplies, though carefully rationed, started diminishing faster than expected. Their stock of dried meat was running out, and local wildlife was far scarcer than they had anticipated. On the 8th day, the first troubling incident occurred, one that, in hindsight, should have been a warning. A woman identified in the surviving notes only as Margaret, from Baltimore, Maryland, suddenly fell ill. She suffered from a high fever and severe stomach pain. Dr. Thomas Hicks did his best to treat her, but in such conditions, with no real medical tools or proper medication beyond a few basic remedies, he could offer only minimal relief. Margaret needed rest, but turning back was impossible, and the next settlement was still days away. The situation sparked disagreement. Some wanted to stop and wait for her recovery. Others argued they had to move forward before their resources ran out. After hours of debate, they reached a compromise. 2 volunteers would remain with Margaret in a small shelter, while the others continued ahead to find help and return for them later. The volunteers were James Dalton, one of the brothers from Charleston, and Ruth Peterson, a middle-aged woman from Pittsburgh with some nursing background. With heavy hearts, the remaining 11 set out once more. Sarah wrote in her journal that their parting was filled with tears, lingering embraces, and promises of a swift reunion. Despite her pain, Margaret managed a brave smile, assuring them she'd recover soon. None of them knew it would be the last time they saw the 3 alive. That farewell marked the beginning of a chain of events that would turn their expedition into one of the most haunting mysteries in Appalachian history. Over the next few days, an unsettling tension took hold. The previously mild weather began to shift. Dark clouds gathered over the ridges, and the air thickened, the kind of oppressive stillness that signals an approaching storm. Professor Edmund Whitmore, who had studied meteorology alongside geology, warned that autumn storms in these mountains were notorious for their ferocity and unpredictability. On the 10th night, the storm struck. It wasn't just rain, it was chaos unleashed. The forest transformed into something wild and hostile. Gale-force winds bent trees nearly to breaking, sending branches crashing to the ground. Lightning split the sky again and again, each strike followed by thunder that rolled through the valleys like cannon fire. The rain didn't fall, it lashed sideways, seeping through every seam and flap of their tents. The group huddled together, soaked and terrified, praying their shelters wouldn't collapse, or that a tree wouldn't fall on them. Sarah later described that night as the most terrifying experience of her life. The noise was relentless, a deafening chorus of wind, rain, and thunder, punctuated by the groaning of the forest itself. Sleep was impossible. All anyone could think about was surviving until morning. When daylight finally came, the devastation was shocking. The trail they had followed was gone, buried under mud, branches, and debris. Streams that had once been calm trickles were now raging torrents. One tent had been destroyed entirely. Its occupants had taken refuge with others during the night. Several supplies were soaked and likely spoiled. Then came an even greater blow. Their maps, carefully guarded by William Fletcher, were ruined. The paper was soaked through. The pencil lines blurred beyond recognition. The landmarks and notes they'd used to navigate were lost, and with the post-storm fog still hanging low, even the direction they faced became uncertain. They were stranded deep in the Appalachians, with dwindling food, damaged gear, and 3 companions waiting behind. And the nightmare had only begun. The confusion that followed shattered their morale. William Fletcher, the amateur cartographer, blamed himself endlessly. He spent hours examining the ruined scraps, trying to reconstruct the route from memory and the faint traces still visible. His companions tried to reassure him, but everyone knew the truth. They were lost. Dr. Hicks called a meeting, hoping to restore calm and reason. Sitting on damp logs, still shivering from the cold rain, the 11 survivors discussed their choices. Should they turn back for Margaret, James, and Ruth, or push forward in hopes of reaching help sooner? And if they went forward, how could they even be sure of the direction? Professor Whitmore suggested using the sun's position as their guide. Even through partial cloud cover, they could roughly determine where west lay. Their goal was to head southwest toward the settlements of eastern Tennessee. He also proposed marking trees with knife cuts as they advanced, creating a makeshift trail in case they needed to retrace their steps. The idea offered some comfort. It wasn't perfect, but it was a plan. For the next 3 days, the group trudged slowly through brutal terrain. The forest grew denser, with snarled undergrowth forcing detours every few meters. They waded through knee-deep icy streams, scaled slick, jagged slopes, and battled exhaustion with every step, where each step had to be taken with care, skirting ravines whose depths were impossible to gauge beneath the thick canopy. The group's exhaustion was becoming obvious. Several began coughing from the cold, damp air, others complained of aching joints and stiff muscles. It was on the 14th day that they stumbled upon something deeply unsettling. Following what seemed to be a natural forest trail, they entered a clearing that was clearly not formed by nature. In its center lay the remnants of an old wooden structure, collapsed, moss covered, and nearly consumed by vegetation. Nearby, stones arranged in a circle showed where a fire had once burned, and scattered across the area, half buried in earth and rot, were the remnants of human presence. Edmund Whitmore, ever the scholar, examined the site with care. He found fragments of pottery, scraps of fabric so decayed they disintegrated to the touch, and, most disturbing of all, small stone piles deliberately arranged. Grave markers by all appearances. Sarah noted in her diary that the place carried a heavy, almost suffocating atmosphere, as though echoes of old sorrow still lingered there. No one wanted to linger long, yet questions hung in the air. Who had lived or died here? When? And what fate had met them? Robert Dalton, the elder Charleston brother, speculated it might have been a hunting outpost, or perhaps a failed homestead. Others wondered if it had belonged to Civil War refugees who'd fled into the mountains some 40 years earlier, still haunted by the conflict's scars. Dr. Hicks, however, offered a darker reflection. He reminded them that these ranges were infamous for disappearances. Travelers would venture deep into uncharted paths, never to return. Sometimes their belongings were found years later, sometimes nothing at all, as if the forest had swallowed them whole. Their uneasy discussion was cut short by a sound that froze them in place. Distant, unmistakably human voices. Their hearts leapt between hope and dread. Voices could mean help or danger. After a tense debate, they decided to approach quietly, moving through the brush as silently as possible. As they drew closer, the murmurs became clearer. 2, maybe 3 people were speaking, calmly, even joking. The group crept forward until they could see through the trees. Ahead was a small camp, 2 poorly pitched tents, a crackling fire, and 3 men standing around it. Their clothes were filthy and torn, their faces rough with unshaven beards. They didn't seem immediately threatening, yet something about them, an unease in their bearing, felt wrong. One of the men, tall and gaunt with a long, tangled beard, gestured wildly as he spoke. The others listened and laughed occasionally. William Fletcher whispered that they should reveal themselves. These men clearly knew the mountains and might offer guidance. But Edmund Whitmore hesitated. Something in his instincts urged caution, an unexplainable feeling that things weren't as they seemed. Sarah later wrote that the air itself felt charged, as though the group stood on the edge of a decision that would alter everything. Before any agreement could be reached, one of the younger hikers, Daniel Foster from Norfolk, Virginia, took matters into his own hands. He rose from his crouch and stepped into the open, hands raised in a gesture of peace. The three men turned sharply toward him, startled. For a long, silent moment, no one moved. Then the tall man with the beard smiled. A smile that didn't reach his eyes, a smile that made everyone's stomach tighten. He said something Daniel couldn't quite catch, his tone superficially friendly. Daniel waved for the others to join him. Reluctantly, the rest of the group emerged from the trees. What followed happened quickly and would later only be pieced together from fragmented accounts. The strangers introduced themselves, using names that would prove false. They invited the travelers to share their fire, even claiming to know a shortcut to the nearest settlement. Desperate, exhausted, and half-starved, the group accepted the offer. Yet as dusk crept through the trees, small inconsistencies began to emerge. The strangers asked too many questions about their route, their supplies, whether others were with them. Their eyes lingered on the group's equipment a little too long, and when they thought no one was watching, they exchanged glances that spoke of silent understanding. Sarah's final diary entry captured the feeling precisely. She wrote that it was as if they had stepped into a den of predators disguised as hosts. She had no idea how right she was. As darkness deepened, the air in the camp grew taut with tension. Dr. Hicks, who had seen much of human nature in his years, began noticing discrepancies in their story. The men claimed to be fur trappers who had lived off the land for years, but their gear told a different tale. There were no traps, no hides, none of the smells or tools one would expect from trappers. Their weapons were poorly maintained, streaked with rust. Edmund Whitmore, too, sensed danger as he questioned them further, trying to make sense of the landscape and pinpoint their location. The answers he received from the three men were muddled and inconsistent. One claimed a river lay a few hours north, only for another to insist it flowed to the south. What might have seemed like harmless confusion began to feel like deliberate deceit, and tension quietly spread among the travelers like an oncoming storm. Robert Dalton, whose years in Charleston had taught him to read danger in people's behavior, started signaling the others with subtle nods and glances. His message was clear. Stay alert, trust no one. Sarah caught these silent exchanges and felt her pulse quicken. Her imagination, so often her greatest strength, now became her worst enemy as she pictured countless dark possibilities. Dinner unfolded beneath a heavy silence, broken only by forced attempts at small talk. The strangers offered a thin stew of unclear origin, its ingredients explained with vague gestures. Hunger forced some of the 11 travelers to eat, though wariness lingered in every movement. Others only pushed the food around their plates, unwilling to risk consuming anything from their unsettling hosts. When night descended and the flickering firelight became their only defense against the vast darkness of the forest, the bearded man made what sounded like a sensible offer. He and his companions would take the first watch, allowing the weary travelers to sleep. His reasoning was simple. Wild animals sometimes prowled nearby, drawn by the smell of food. William Fletcher, choosing his words with care, countered with a compromise. Both groups, he said, should keep their own watches through the night to ensure everyone's safety. The bearded man forced a short, humorless laugh in response. He agreed, but his narrowing eyes betrayed irritation. The travelers pitched their tents at a cautious distance, far enough to suggest polite independence, but clearly intended as a safety buffer. Quietly, they arranged for at least 3 people to remain awake at all times, watching both the strangers' camp and the forest's dark periphery. Sarah took the first shift with Edmund Whitmore and Charles Brennan, a broad-shouldered dockworker from Wilmington known for his readiness to fight if needed. They positioned themselves carefully, the dying fire at their backs to preserve their night vision, their eyes sweeping the tree line for movement. The early hours passed in uneasy quiet. Owls called from somewhere unseen, small creatures rustled in the underbrush, and the fire's embers hissed softly, but the silence carried an edge. In her diary, Sarah wrote of feeling observed, not only by the 3 men nearby, but by something unseen, something that seemed to linger just beyond the edge of light. Around midnight, beneath a half-hidden moon, Edmund noticed motion from the strangers' camp. The 3 men, who should have been asleep, were whispering urgently, their silhouettes restless and agitated. Edmund signaled the others, and the watchers grew tense. Moments later, One of the men rose and started toward the travelers' tents. His steps were too controlled, too casual to be natural, like someone trying hard not to look suspicious. Charles Brennan moved to intercept him, his voice low but firm as he asked if there was an issue. The stranger hesitated, clearly surprised to find anyone awake. He muttered something about needing water, though the nearest stream lay in the opposite direction. Charles gestured toward it, blocking the man's path with quiet authority. The stranger paused, his gaze flicking into the darkness, measuring what he couldn't see, then turned back without another word. Unease rippled through the watchers as he disappeared into the shadows. Sarah's skin prickled. The chill she felt wasn't from the cold. Edmund finally spoke what all three were already thinking. They had to leave at first light. No farewells, no explanations. Just go, Charles agreed, suggesting they wake the others before dawn and prepare to depart silently. The remainder of the night dragged on, thick with tension. Every creak, every sigh of wind felt like a threat. The three men made no further approaches, but their campfire still glowed faintly, and figures occasionally shifted beside it. It was a quiet standoff, each side aware, each waiting for daylight to break the balance. When the first grey light began seeping through the trees, Sarah, Edmund, and Charles moved swiftly from tent to tent, whispering instructions. Pack quickly. Stay silent. Leave immediately. There would be no breakfast, no goodbyes, only escape. But destiny, or perhaps the forest itself, intervened. As they folded the last tent, a piercing scream shattered the dawn. It was sharp, terrified, and unmistakably female. Panic rippled through the group as they realized the voice belonged to Helen Morrison of Raleigh, North Carolina, who had gone moments earlier to fetch water from the creek. The scream was followed by violent sounds, branches breaking, a struggle erupting somewhere in the trees beyond the camp, and the harsh bark of men shouting orders that made no sense. The group froze, paralyzed by indecision, torn between the impulse to help and the desperate urge to flee. It was Dr. Thomas Ricks who finally acted. Bound by his duty as a physician, he couldn't stand by while Helen screamed for her life. Without hesitation, he sprinted toward the sound, and three others followed: Edmund, Charles, and Robert. When they reached the creek, the scene before them was chaos. Helen was struggling in the grip of two rough-looking men who were not from the nearby camp. These were different figures stepping from the forest shadows as if they'd been lying in wait all along. And in that instant, the rescuers realized the horrifying truth. They had walked straight into a trap. The situation unraveled in moments. The two men restraining Helen were joined by several others emerging from the trees. 4, maybe 5, each with the confidence and coordination of men accustomed to violence. Dr. Ricks raised his hands, voice steady but urgent, pleading for Helen's release. His attempt at diplomacy drew only coarse laughter. Edmund Whitmore tried reasoning, explaining they were travelers who had lost their way, who meant no harm and wanted only to leave peacefully. Yet even as he spoke, his gaze darted across the scene, calculating their chances, looking for any path of escape. It was Charles Brennan who first grasped the full scale of the danger. Through the dense growth behind the attackers, he caught sight of more movement. The three men from the camp were approaching. But instead of intervening on their behalf, they joined the others, blending seamlessly into the group. The truth was undeniable now: the travelers had stumbled into the territory of an organized band. These men were not simple thieves or wanderers. They were outlaws, fugitives, deserters, or men who had long since abandoned civilization. They had built their own grim existence in the wilderness, sustained by taking from whoever was unfortunate enough to cross their path. Robert Dalton's thoughts flashed briefly to his brother James and the two women left behind in the main camp, Margaret and Ruth. If this band operated here, what chance did the weaker members have? But there was no time for fear. The only goal now was survival for everyone. The leader of the woodsmen stepped forward, a broad, scarred man whose voice was gravelly and rarely used for calm speech. He announced that the travelers were trespassing and that safe passage required payment. His eyes swept over their possessions, their backpacks, tools, and clothing, with predatory intent. The meaning was clear: he wanted everything. Dr. Ricks tried to reason with him, offering food, medicine, even part of their supplies in exchange for safe passage and directions. The man considered, then slowly shook his head. His terms were far worse. He demanded weapons, gear, fine clothing, and his gaze lingered disturbingly long on the women among them. Back at the camp, Sarah felt her stomach twist with dread. Even without hearing words, she knew something was terribly wrong near the stream. Realizing negotiation was hopeless, Edmund acted on instinct. He shouted, not to the men confronting him, but toward the camp behind them, "Run! Take everything and go now." His warning was both a plea and a sacrifice. The moment the words left his mouth, the forest erupted into chaos. The outlaws lunged forward in rage, and the fight began. Edmund, Thomas, Charles, and Robert defended themselves with desperate force. Charles fought like a cornered animal, his years of hard labor turning into brutal efficiency. Robert swung wildly but effectively, driven by terror and adrenaline. The air filled with the clash of bodies, the snap of branches, and cries of pain. Amid the confusion, Helen tore free from her captors and bolted toward the camp, her clothes torn, her face ghostly with panic. Her arrival was all the signal the others needed. Sarah and the remaining 5 members grabbed whatever they could carry: maps, food, weapons, abandoning the rest. They had no direction, no plan, only the urgent need to run. William Fletcher, breathing hard, tried to remember fragments from their ruined maps. The professor had once mentioned that following water would lead downward, toward settlements. The stream flowed downhill, it might be their only chance. Meanwhile, the 4 men at the creek fought their way free and fled toward the camp, battered but alive. Edmund's head bled from a deep gash, and Thomas's hands were sliced open where he had tried to wrench a knife from an attacker. Behind them, furious shouts rose from the trees as the woodsmen regrouped for pursuit. When the 4 men stumbled back into camp, they found the others already on edge, packs slung and faces pale with dread. There was no time for plans or debate. Sarah pointed toward the direction William had proposed, downstream along the creek, and everyone nodded in grim agreement. Without another word, they began to move, half running, half stumbling through the tangled undergrowth, carrying whatever they could manage and leaving the rest behind. Behind them, the sounds of pursuit grew louder, shouts echoing through the trees, the crunch of boots breaking branches, and now and then the crack of gunfire. The shots didn't seem aimed to kill, but to terrify, to drive them faster into panic. The woodsmen knew the land. They moved with ease through the terrain. But the travelers had something just as powerful: the raw, desperate strength born of sheer fear. They pushed forward for hours, stopping only when someone tripped or the path ahead was blocked, forcing them to wade through freezing water or climb steep, slippery slopes. The stream became their lifeline, their only compass in a wilderness that otherwise seemed endless. At times, it cut through narrow ravines where they had to walk waist deep in icy water. At others, it plunged down sudden drops that forced them to cling to roots and rock faces just to descend safely. As exhaustion set in, the group began to fracture. The stronger ones pulled ahead while the weaker lagged behind. They called to each other, trying to stay together, but fatigue and chaos slowly tore them apart. Edmund, still dazed from his head injury, began to falter. Sarah and another woman tried to support him, but their pace slowed dangerously. Then came the moment they all dreaded, when they realized that not everyone was still with them. Voices shouted names through the forest, but the replies grew fainter, then stopped altogether. Panic took hold as the truth sank in: they were no longer one group. Some had fallen behind, or worse. By the time the sun began to sink below the ridge, only 7 of the original 11 remained together. 4 had vanished without a trace: Edmund Whitmore, Helen Morrison, David Richardson of Alexandria, and Patricia Caldwell of Savannah. Whether captured or lost, no one could say. The survivors finally found a shallow cave beneath an outcrop of rock, a crude shelter, but enough to hide them from sight. There they huddled together, shivering from cold and hunger, too drained to speak much. What had begun as an expedition full of optimism had turned into a nightmare of loss and despair. 14 had set out on this journey. Now only 7 remained. Sarah Crawford, her instinct to document unbroken even in terror, wrote what she could by the faint light of dawn. Her handwriting was shaky, uneven, nothing like the graceful script that had once filled her journal. She wrote of Dr. Hicks, feverish and bleeding from his own wounds, still tending to others with what little strength he had left. She recorded how Charles Brennan refused to sleep, keeping watch at the mouth of the cave with his weapon in hand, his eyes never leaving the forest. William Fletcher sat apart, staring into the shadows as if trying to redraw the maps he had once trusted. He estimated they had traveled 15, maybe 20 miles from where they'd first met the three false guides. By his reckoning, they were descending. Lower in elevation now, perhaps closer to settled ground. But with no landmarks, no compass, and no certainty of direction, his calculations were little more than hopeful guesses. Robert Dalton sat silently in one corner, haunted by thoughts of his brother James. He had promised to protect him, to bring him home safely. Now, he had no idea whether James, Margaret, or Ruth were even alive, or if they had met the same fate as those taken by the woodsman. The two remaining women suffered in silence. Elizabeth of Charlottesville coughed violently, blood staining her palm. Dr. Hicks recognized the signs of pneumonia, but could offer only warmth and water. Medicine was long gone. Catherine Morse of Baltimore had retreated into herself, alternating between quiet sobs and eerie calm, her mind seemingly fractured by fear. The final member, George Patterson of Richmond, broke his long silence that night. Faced with the nearness of death, he began speaking softly. Confessions of his youth, mistakes, regrets, people he wished he'd made peace with. His words, though sorrowful, offered a strange comfort, reminding them all that they were still human, still bound by fragile hope. Morning came grey and cold, with a fine mist soaking their clothes. The drizzle made everything worse. Food nearly gone, bodies aching, nerves frayed. Something had to be done. Charles checked his meagre supplies, some rope, a fishing line, and a single blade. They couldn't stay, they would starve or be found. Dr. Hicks, voice weak but resolute, insisted they move. Elizabeth's fever was climbing. If they didn't find help soon, she would die. And so, mid-morning, they set off again, moving slower now, their pace broken by pain and exhaustion. The stream was still their only guide, winding through the endless wilderness, leading them onward toward a salvation they could no longer even picture, but had no choice except to seek. The surrounding terrain began to shift in subtle ways. Thick forest gradually gave way to open stretches, hinting they were nearing lands once touched by human hands. They spotted fallen tree trunks, the remnants of long abandoned logging. A decayed fence line appeared, its wooden posts still faintly marking boundaries from another era. These traces rekindled hope, though urgency pressed harder with every step. Elizabeth could hardly walk now, supported on one side by Sarah and on the other by Catherine. George Patterson, despite his years, pushed on with remarkable endurance, helping to carry the small amount of gear that remained. William Fletcher continued marking trees whenever possible, an almost compulsive act, as if leaving signs behind gave him the illusion of control. By mid-afternoon, a faint sound reached them, so surreal that at first they doubted their own senses. It was the ringing of a bell, distant yet clear, echoing rhythmically through the forest. Bells meant a church, and a church meant people. They exchanged disbelieving looks, hearts pounding, before surging toward the sound with the last fragments of their strength. As they drew closer, new signs of civilization emerged: a wagon, rutted dirt path, sturdier fences enclosing pastures, and finally smoke rising from chimneys between the trees. They had found a settlement. The village was small, a handful of wooden houses clustered around a modest white church. But to the 7 survivors, it looked like heaven after days of terror. They stumbled into the main clearing, their torn clothing, mud-streaked faces, and injuries drawing alarmed gasps from the townsfolk. The church's pastor, a kindly middle-aged man named Reverend Jonathan Mills, was the first to reach them. His concern was immediate and genuine as he asked where they had come from and what had happened. Their story spilled out in fragments, overlapping voices painting a picture so unbelievable that a few locals struggled to accept it. Getting lost in the mountains wasn't rare, but the horrors these 7 described were beyond anything the villagers had heard. Despite his weakness, Thomas Ricks kept his focus on what mattered most. Elizabeth's condition. Barely conscious and burning with fever, she was on the edge of collapse. Ricks pleaded for anyone with medical knowledge or medicine. Reverend Mills acted swiftly, leading them to a woman known in the area as a healer and midwife. While Elizabeth received care, the rest were taken to the church, where they were given food, clean water, and blankets. Sitting on the hard pews beneath flickering lanterns, they felt, for the first time in days, the faint comfort of safety. But as that feeling settled in, the reality struck deeper. They had survived, but half their group was still gone. Sarah Crawford, her instinct to record stronger than exhaustion, asked for paper and ink. She needed to document everything before memory blurred. Reverend Mills provided the materials, and she began to write, her handwriting trembling but her resolve firm. That account, preserved in church records and later moved to county archives, would become one of the few first-hand documents about the grim events of September 1903. Yet the writing did nothing to change the truth. 10 people were still missing in those mountains, their fates uncertain. The place where the survivors found refuge was called Milliton, an isolated hamlet in eastern Tennessee, cradled by mountains that guarded it from the world even as they cut it off from it. Fewer than 100 people lived there. Families who had farmed the same land for generations, largely untouched by the progress of the new century. To them, the modern world was something distant, almost mythic. The morning after the survivors' arrival, Reverend Mills convened a town meeting in the small church. Oil lamps flickered as nearly every resident gathered to hear the tale. Sarah Crawford, pale and weary, stood before them and recounted the ordeal in detail. Her voice faltered at times, but she spared no truth. Faces in the pews mirrored horror, pity, and something darker, recognition. When she finished, silence filled the room until an old man in the front row spoke. His name was Samuel Whittaker, the oldest living resident of Milliton. His voice was frail but carried the weight of years. He said the mountains had always drawn those seeking to vanish from society. Some harmless hermits, others dangerous outlaws. Rumors had long whispered of hidden groups living deep in the wilderness, called by many names: the cave people, the forest ghosts, the unseen. Hunters told of screams in the night, of abandoned camps that hinted at sudden violence, of travelers who entered the woods and never came back. Most dismissed these as superstition, bedtime tales to frighten children. But Samuel, meeting the survivors' eyes, said plainly that every story began with a truth. Charles Brennan asked the question on everyone's mind. If the townsfolk knew such threats existed, why hadn't they warned outsiders or called for help? Samuel's answer was grimly simple. Authorities were days away, and by the time they came, there was nothing left to find. The mountain people knew every cave, every trail, and could vanish long before outsiders approached. And Milliton, with its small population, couldn't risk provoking them. Confrontation would bring revenge, and so the villagers had learned to stay silent, protect their own, and avoid the places best left forgotten. The villagers had long learned to survive quietly, avoiding any attention that might draw danger their way. For the survivors, the realization that locals had known, at least in part, about the threats lurking in the mountains brought a storm of emotions. There was anger that warnings hadn't been given, yet also an uneasy understanding. Life in such isolation demanded choices where morality often bent to the demands of survival. Thomas Ricks broke the silence with the question that weighed on them all: what could be done for the 10 who were still missing? Was there any hope of finding them alive, or at least recovering their remains if the worst had occurred? Reverend Mills promised he would organize a search effort, though he cautioned them to be realistic. The men of Milliton were not soldiers or expert trackers. They were farmers, carpenters, and tradesmen. Venturing into the wilds against possibly organized and violent men would be perilous. Time was also against them. 3 days had already passed since the 7 survivors had escaped. Every hour made rescue less likely. William Fletcher provided his notes and rough sketches of their route, though he admitted that much of it was guesswork. Once panic had taken over, direction had meant little beyond moving as fast as possible. He could describe some landmarks and terrain features, but not with enough precision to guarantee success. Despite this, the townsfolk agreed that something had to be done. 6 men volunteered, led by a seasoned hunter named Marcus Webb, who knew the surrounding wilderness better than anyone in the valley. They would leave at dawn, carrying 5 days' provisions and following the best reconstruction Fletcher could offer. Charles Brennan insisted on joining them despite his injuries. He felt personally responsible for those left behind and refused to live with the guilt of inaction. While preparations were underway, Elizabeth's condition deteriorated rapidly in the healer's care. Pneumonia had consumed her lungs, and though herbal medicines and constant tending offered brief moments of hope, the fever refused to break. Thomas Ricks remained at her side, cooling her forehead, urging her to drink, doing all his medical training allowed. On the 3rd day after reaching Milliton, Elizabeth's breathing slowed and finally stopped. She became the first confirmed casualty of the expedition, though none doubted she would not be the last. Her funeral took place in the small churchyard beneath a colorless sky that seemed to share in their grief. Reverend Mills read a eulogy written by Sarah Crawford, a tribute to a woman who had sought adventure and discovery, but found only loss. Catherine Morse wept uncontrollably. Her sorrow mingled with the weight of everything they had endured. The villagers attended in full, a gesture of compassion that deeply moved the survivors. At dawn the next day, Marcus Webb, his 5 companions, and Charles Brennan departed, their faces grim but resolute. Everyone understood how slim their chances were, but doing nothing felt unbearable. The survivors left behind could only wait, 5 long days filled with restless anxiety. Sarah continued to write obsessively, documenting each conversation, each flicker of hope or despair. Robert Dalton wandered the village endlessly, haunted by thoughts of his brother. Thomas Ricks, hollowed by guilt and Elizabeth's death, withdrew into silence. George Patterson spent hours speaking quietly with Reverend Mills about faith, fate, and human suffering. Catherine Morse sat in the church for hours each day, staring wordlessly at the crucifix as though begging for answers. William Fletcher pored over his maps again and again, desperate to find something he'd overlooked. When the search party finally returned, their faces told the story before any words were spoken. They had located the place where the group's first camp had stood, but it was deserted. Following the creek downstream, they found scattered remnants of gear that the survivors recognized, but no bodies, no tracks, no living soul. It was as if the missing 10 had been erased from existence, swallowed by the wilderness itself. The report hit the survivors like a physical blow. Charles Brennan came back bruised, exhausted, and hollow-eyed. He described what they had seen. Fresh campsite traces deliberately wiped clean, trees carved with symbols Marcus Webb identified as warnings used by hidden mountain clans, and, in one place, signs that something heavy had been dragged through the forest, the trail ending abruptly at a sheer cliff. Privately, Marcus shared his grim assessment with Reverend Mills, unaware that Sarah overheard. He believed their attackers weren't random outlaws, but members of a long-established network that had lived and operated in these mountains for generations. The evidence pointed to permanent camps, hidden routes, and a warning system that alerted them whenever outsiders entered their territory. A rescue by force, he concluded, would be suicidal, and almost certainly pointless. Faced with this reality, the remaining survivors were forced to confront an agonizing question: should they stay in Militin? Clinging to the faint hope of news that might never come, or return home to deliver the devastating truth to the families of those still lost. Missing. And perhaps most painfully, should they alert the authorities, knowing it could take months to organize a response and might even risk more lives, with no promise of success. William Fletcher proposed a more practical solution. He suggested sending 1 or 2 members of their group to the nearest telegraph town, which Reverend Mills said lay 3 days east, a settlement called Greenville. From there, they could contact both government officials and the families of the missing men. Meanwhile, the others would stay behind in Militin to recover and await any new developments. Despite his growing despair, Thomas Ricks agreed this was the most rational course. He volunteered to travel to Greenville himself, driven by a need to act rather than sit idle. Robert Dalton immediately offered to join him, desperate to do anything that might bring answers about his brother James. The villagers provided them with horses and a guide. A quiet young man named Daniel, who moved through the mountain trails with effortless familiarity. Thomas and Robert's departure left only 4 survivors in Militin: Sarah Crawford, Charles Brennan, George Patterson, and Catherine Morse. Each struggled to cope with the trauma in their own way. Sarah immersed herself in writing, filling endless pages with observations and reflections as she tried to impose order on chaos. Charles threw himself into hard labor, repairing fences, helping with harvests, doing anything that kept his mind occupied and his grief at bay. George Patterson found an unexpected calling when he began teaching the town's children. With no proper school in Militin, education had been left to families with uneven results. George, once a teacher in Richmond, began informal lessons in the church, reading, writing, arithmetic, finding purpose and peace in the act of giving knowledge. But Catherine Morse could not find comfort in anything. Her spirit seemed broken. She spoke rarely, ate little, and spent hours gazing toward the mountains, as if expecting her lost friends to emerge from the trees. The healer who had tended to Elizabeth grew increasingly worried, recognizing in Catherine the same vacant despair that often preceded tragedy. Meanwhile, in Greenville, Thomas and Robert met only frustration. Sheriff Joseph Cartwright listened to their account with thinly veiled skepticism. He'd heard countless tales about strange happenings in the mountains, and experience had taught him that most were exaggerated. People got lost, made poor decisions, fell victim to the wilderness. Organized criminal groups, possible, but nearly impossible to prove or pursue with his limited resources. Still, the condition of the two men, along with Sarah's meticulous documentation, convinced him to send telegrams to nearby cities and to begin contacting the missing men's families. He promised to arrange an official expedition once he had enough manpower and proper authorization, though he warned that it could take weeks, even months. For Robert, that was unbearable. Every passing week meant his brother's survival chances vanished. Desperation turned to fury. He began plotting to return to the mountains alone. Thomas tried to reason with him, but their discussions grew into late, night arguments, their voices echoing through the narrow halls of their small hotel. Hope clashed against logic, duty against despair. Then, one night, everything changed. A messenger arrived with a telegram addressed to Thomas. The message was short but devastating. Catherine Morse was dead. The note said she had gone into the mountains alone, despite warnings, and her body was later discovered at the bottom of a canyon. Whether it was an accident or something intentional, no one could say. The news shattered both men. Catherine had survived the unthinkable, only to die when they thought safety had finally been reached. Guilt consumed them. How could they not have seen how fragile she'd become? They should have protected her, should have stayed vigilant. Thomas decided to return to Millerton immediately, believing the survivors needed his medical and emotional support. Robert remained in Greenville to pressure the authorities and oversee the bureaucratic process. They parted with heavy hearts, each burdened by grief and responsibility. When Thomas reached Millerton a week later, he found a town cloaked in mourning. Catherine had been buried beside Elizabeth, and Reverend Mills had held another solemn service. Sarah, ever the recorder, had documented every moment, but her writing had changed, fragmented and wary, as if even her will to make sense of tragedy had begun to crumble. Now, only 4 survivors remained. Of the 14 who had begun the journey, just 4 lived to tell the tale. 2 were confirmed dead, and 8 were still missing. Swallowed by the wilderness, their fate unknown. In the weeks that followed, a fragile rhythm returned. Sarah kept writing but also joined in the village chores, finding a strange peace in physical work. Charles Brennan became part of the Millerton community, too afraid of the emptiness waiting beyond it to leave. George Patterson continued teaching, using education as a balm against grief. But Thomas Ricks sank deeper into despair. He began drinking heavily, relying on locally distilled alcohol to dull the unbearable pain he couldn't otherwise face. His hands, still damaged from the confrontation at the creek, never recovered properly. The wounds worsened, developing into a severe infection that a doctor in Greenville would later diagnose as osteomyelitis. The bitter irony of a physician unable to heal himself was not lost on anyone. By mid-November of that year, Wine-Dinty-3, nearly 2 months after the expedition had begun with such promise, Robert Dalton finally returned to Millerton bearing news. The authorities had at last organized an official search mission led by Sheriff Joseph Cartwright, consisting of 10 deputies and 3 seasoned trackers. Their goal: to spend 2 full weeks in the mountains pursuing every lead and uncovering any evidence of what had happened to the missing men. The team departed Greenville on a bitterly cold late November morning, just as the first snow began blanketing the upper peaks of the Appalachians. Sheriff Cartwright led his men alongside 2 expert trackers from Tennessee and Virginia, professionals renowned for finding what others deemed untraceable. Robert Dalton insisted on joining them, as did Marcus Webb from Millerton, who still felt accountable for the failure of the initial search. Back in Millerton, the remaining 4 survivors waited in paralyzing suspense, hope and dread intertwined. Sarah Crawford spent the days restless and sleepless, unable to focus on writing or anything else. Charles Brennan drove himself into relentless physical labor, as though exhaustion could silence the torment in his mind. George Patterson turned to prayer for the first time in years, believing that only faith could make sense of the unbearable. Meanwhile, Thomas Ricks, his mind and body deteriorating, rarely left the small room he occupied in a villager's home. His infected hands throbbed constantly, rendering him nearly helpless. Fevers came in waves, and in his delirium, he often muttered to invisible figures, sometimes addressing Elizabeth as if she still lived, other times shouting warnings to imagined companions about unseen threats. 14 days later, the official expedition returned. Their snow-covered faces told the story before anyone spoke. There was no good news. Sheriff Cartwright convened a meeting in the Militan church to share his findings with the villagers and the survivors. What he reported was both illuminating and deeply unsettling. The search party had located several sites matching the survivors' descriptions. They found the original campsite where the 3 suspects had been seen. But it was empty, cleared of any recent signs of life. They traced portions of the creek route described in earlier testimonies. Yet in a remote, hidden valley, they uncovered something that chilled even the most hardened trackers: a network of caves and semi-permanent shelters, evidence of a large, organized group. The camp had been recently abandoned. Ashes in the fire pits were still fresh, and the trackers estimated activity within the last 4 to 6 weeks. Among the discarded remains were bits of clothing, utensils, and, most disturbingly, personal items likely belonging to travelers rather than permanent mountain dwellers. One of these was a small Bible bearing an inscription, Margaret Henderson, identified by Robert as belonging to the woman who had fallen ill early in the expedition. The discovery confirmed that at least some of the missing had passed through that place. Yet it raised even more questions than it answered. No human remains were found in the caves, no graves, no signs of struggle. It was as though the inhabitants had vanished into thin air, leaving behind only fragments of their existence. The trackers, drawing from years of experience, proposed a grim but plausible theory. The people occupying that wilderness maintained a sophisticated system. They moved swiftly when threatened, retreating through secret paths to alternative camps unknown to outsiders. The mountains were vast and treacherous, filled with hidden passages, uncharted caves, and dense forests. A determined, well-adapted group could live unseen there indefinitely. As for the missing members of the expedition, the trackers could offer no certainty. Some might have been captured, forced to labor, or assimilated into the mountain group. Others may have succumbed to exposure, starvation, or injury while trying to escape. The sheer size and peril of the region made every possibility equally believable. Sheriff Cartwright was blunt in his conclusion. With the limited manpower and resources available, there was nothing more he could do. He had filed full reports with state authorities and sketched maps marking suspected areas of activity. But launching a large-scale military operation in the onset of winter would be both perilous and likely pointless. The people they sought were ghosts, intimately familiar with the terrain and capable of vanishing long before any official force could close in. The realization hit the survivors like a final verdict. There would be no rescue, no justice, no closure, only loss. Robert Dalton, who had clung to hope through every ordeal, finally broke. Inside the dimly lit church, he collapsed into tears, his body trembling as the truth overwhelmed him. He had failed to keep the promise he made to his parents, to protect his brother James. Sarah Crawford held him as he wept, silent tears streaking her own face. She thought of Edmund Whitmore, the gifted scholar whose curiosity had sparked the expedition. Of Helen Morrison, whose vibrant life had been cut short. Of all the others, their faces frozen in memory, smiling in that photograph taken in Damascus before it all began. Even Charles Brennan, usually composed and stoic, was overcome by the weight of finality. He had come to admire and depend on his fellow travelers, and to know that so many had simply vanished felt like an affront to nature itself. People weren't meant to disappear without a trace. There should have been evidence, remains, something. But the mountains didn't obey the rules of the civilized world, and neither did the men who lived and killed within their shadows. George Patterson, ever the thinker, tried to put things into perspective. He spoke of how countless people vanished every year across the vast American landscape. Travelers on lonely highways, settlers in untamed frontiers, explorers lost in uncharted wilderness. The sheer immensity of the land meant that not every disappearance could be explained, Not every story would find an ending. It was a grim truth, but a truthful one nonetheless. His reflections brought little comfort, yet they provided something more honest than hollow reassurance. In the aftermath of the final revelation, the 4 survivors were forced to confront their futures. Would they remain in Millerton, trapped in a cycle of grief and paralysis, or attempt to return to their previous lives, carrying the invisible wounds that would never fully heal? Thomas Ricks's condition made the first decision for them. His health had deteriorated so severely that he needed medical attention beyond what the small town could offer. Reverend Mills arranged his transport to a hospital in Knoxville, where doctors would try to stop the infection ravaging his bones. On a bleak December morning, Thomas departed so frail he had to be lifted onto the wagon. His eyes, once bright with empathy and intellect, were now hollow, haunted by what he had endured. Sarah, Charles, and George stayed in Millerton through Christmas, joining in the humble celebrations of the townsfolk who had taken them in. Yet, they all knew their stay couldn't last. Their families waited, their lives lay in fragments elsewhere, and responsibilities long abandoned demanded their return. So, in January of 1934, 4 months after venturing into the mountains full of hope, the final 3 survivors left Millerton behind. Together they journeyed to Greenville, where their paths would finally diverge. Their farewell was heavy with emotion. They had endured something no outsider could ever truly comprehend, a bond forged in suffering that words could never capture. They promised to write, to visit, to stay in touch. But deep down, each understood that seeing one another again would be unbearable, a living reminder of everything they had lost. The years that followed that dreadful autumn of 1933 carried each survivor toward a different fate. Sarah Crawford returned to Richmond, burdened not only by memory, but by the extensive diary she had written during the ordeal. Her family barely recognized her at the train station. The spirited young woman who had left seeking inspiration for her novel came back altered, her face lined with sorrow far beyond her 26 years. Her eyes held a darkness that no rest could lift. She tried to resume her writing, but fiction now felt hollow compared to the horror she had lived. Instead, she poured herself into refining her diary, editing, expanding, and preserving every detail while the memories still lingered. She felt a duty to record the truth, to make sure the vanished were not erased from history. In 1905, a small local publisher released her account, titled Silent Mountains. The book received modest attention. Some praised its raw honesty, while others accused her of exaggeration. The insinuations of sensationalism wounded her deeply, but she never defended herself publicly. Those who had survived beside her knew the truth, and that was enough. Charles Brennan returned to Charleston a changed man. His family and friends noticed at once that something essential in him was gone. The sociable, good-natured man had become quiet and withdrawn, plagued by nightmares that left him screaming in the night. Loud noises startled him, crowds made him anxious. What we now know as post-traumatic stress consumed him completely. He tried returning to work at the docks, but his concentration faltered. His thoughts constantly dragged back to the mountains, to moments of terror replayed endlessly in his mind. He questioned every choice he had made, tormented by the idea that he could have saved more lives. Survivor's guilt became his constant companion. In 1907, he sold everything and moved west to the Arizona Territory. In a brief note to Sarah, he wrote that he needed open horizons, land without mountains, somewhere no dense forests could conceal unseen horrors. Sarah never heard from him again. Despite her later attempts to find him through acquaintances, no trace was ever discovered. Like so many others from that cursed expedition, Charles Brennan disappeared. This time by his own will, George Patterson returned to Richmond, but abandoned his old life entirely. In Millerton, he had discovered a calling that his prior existence never offered. He devoted himself to bringing education to isolated mountain communities, traveling through Virginia and Tennessee to establish small rural schools. It became his mission to give children in forgotten places the chance to learn and grow. Though he rarely spoke about the events of 1903, those close to him sensed that they had reshaped him completely. He lived simply, almost ascetically, avoiding any indulgence, as if he didn't deserve comfort when so many had lost everything. George Patterson died in 1921 at the age of 68, remembered throughout the southern Appalachians as a man who gave his life to others. Thomas Ricks spent 6 long months in a Knoxville hospital battling the infection that had consumed his hands. The doctors saved his life, but not his hands. Both were amputated above the wrists, ending his medical career forever, and with it, the vocation that had once defined him. The physical loss devastated Thomas, but the emotional wound ran even deeper. He fell into a depression that he never truly escaped. In his final years, he lived quietly with a niece in Philadelphia, rarely leaving his room, spending long hours gazing blankly out the window. In 1909, the niece wrote to Sarah, informing her that Thomas had passed away peacefully in his sleep. She added that in his final moments, he had called out the names of those from the lost expedition, people Sarah instantly recognized, pleading for their forgiveness for his inability to save them. Even in death, Thomas found no rest from the horrors that had haunted him since those dark days in the mountains. Robert Dalton also never managed to return to a normal life. After leaving Greenville, he spent years wandering the Appalachian region, endlessly searching for clues to his brother James's fate. In small mountain towns, he became a familiar figure, the man obsessed with asking about missing travelers, hidden communities deep in the woods, or strange sightings in the wilderness. Sarah received occasional letters from him, each one growing more desperate, the handwriting increasingly erratic. In 1911, the letters stopped. Despite Sarah's efforts to track him down through local sheriffs and authorities across Tennessee and Virginia, no one had seen him. Like his brother before him, Robert vanished into the same mountains he had sworn to conquer. The fates of the 10 others who disappeared remained an unsolved mystery. Over the decades, rumors surfaced now and then. In 1908, a hunter claimed to have found a lone woman living in a remote cabin deep in the Tennessee wilderness. But when investigators arrived, the cabin was empty. In 1912, bones were discovered in a collapsed cave, but they could never be identified. 4 years later, an elderly man in a North Carolina nursing home confessed that he had once lived among a hidden mountain group, yet his accounts were so inconsistent that they were dismissed as the ramblings of a dying mind. What truly became of Margaret Henderson, James Dalton, Ruth Peterson, Edmund Whitmore, Helen Morrison, David Richardson, Patricia Caldwell, and the rest whose names appeared in Sarah's journal remains unknown. The mountains had claimed them, just as they had countless others who ventured into their shadowed depths and never emerged. Sarah Crawford lived out her remaining years in Richmond, passing away in 1943 at the age of 66. She never married, never had children, and never wrote another work of fiction after her return. Yet, she stayed in contact with the families of the missing until her final days, offering comfort through shared grief and keeping alive the memory of those lost. In her later years, she donated her complete collection of expedition materials, her diary, photographs, letters, and the original manuscript of Silent Mountains, to the Virginia Historical Society. In an accompanying letter, she explained that she wanted the record preserved not as morbid entertainment, but as a tribute to real people, individuals who had dreams, families, and hopes that ended too soon. She wrote that the mountains were magnificent but indifferent, and that anyone entering them should do so with humility and proper preparation. The tragedy that unfolded between 1933 and 1934 never reached national headlines. It was overshadowed by the sweeping pace of modern progress, by wars, inventions, and other disasters that consumed public attention. Yet among the Appalachian communities, the story endured. Parents told their children about the 14 travelers, how only 4 came back, and warned them of the dangers still lurking in those remote mountain hollows where folklore and wilderness still ruled. Today, over a century later, the Appalachian Trail is a well-traveled route crossed safely by thousands each year. Modern hikers benefit from marked trails, shelters, communication systems, and organized rescue teams. It's difficult to imagine that these same mountains were once wild, untamed lands where entire expeditions could vanish without a trace. But the documents remain, records stored quietly in archives, testimonies from an era when nature still held mysteries that human reason could not explain. The photograph taken that September morning in Damascus still exists, 14 smiling faces, brimming with excitement. It was reprinted in Sarah's book, and sometimes displayed in exhibits about Appalachian history. To look at it now is profoundly unsettling, knowing that for most of those faces, it was their final image, the last proof of their existence before the mountains swallowed them whole. the unanswered questions still linger. What truly happened during those autumn weeks? Who were the mysterious men rumored to live deep within the wilderness? What fate befell each of the missing travelers? These mysteries are likely beyond recovery. The mountains guard their secrets well, and those who knew the truth have long since gone to their graves. Some marked, others lost to time. More than 120 years later, all we can do is remember. Remember that these were real people who faced unimaginable odds and paid terrible prices. Remember that nature, however breathtaking, shows no mercy and no preference for who survives. And remember that even in our modern age, with all our progress, there remain mysteries unsolved, places where civilization fades and the unknown still begins. If this story stirred something in you, if the tragedy of the 14 who ventured into the Appalachians in 1903 and the 4 who returned has moved you, consider subscribing to this channel. We bring you real accounts from America's past, stories that still defy explanation, mysteries time has yet to silence. Share your thoughts in the comments, and if you know of similar tales from your own region, we'd love to hear them. Liking this video helps others discover these forgotten histories, stories that deserve to be remembered. Thank you for joining us in exploring one of the darkest and most haunting chapters in Appalachian history. Until the next story,